What if we told you that some of America's most dangerous enemies, names like Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, and even Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, were shaped, trained, or empowered by US foreign policy? Not out of conspiracy, but through calculated decisions, funding rebels in Afghanistan, backing dictators in the Middle East, and dismantling regimes without a plan for what came next. In 1953, the CIA helped overthrow Iran's democratic leader. In the 1980s, America poured billions into arming Afghan fighters, some of whom would go on to form the Taliban and al-Qaeda. And in 2003, the invasion of Iraq cracked open the gates for ISIS to rise from the ashes of Saddam's broken regime. Each move, taken in the name of national interest, but each leaving behind a power vacuum and enemies far worse than the ones before. So how did America's fight for global influence end up building the very monsters it would later go to war with? Let's unravel the story of how US foreign policy created its own enemies, from Tehran to Kabul, Baghdad to Raqqa, and how the cost of those choices continues to echo across the world. To understand how this all began, we have to go back to 1953, when the CIA made its first big move in Iran. On the surface, it looked like just another political standoff in the Middle East. But behind the scenes, this was the beginning of a geopolitical earthquake that would shake US-Iran relations for decades to come. At the center of it all was Mohammad Mossadegh. He wasn't a radical or a cleric. He was actually a secular, Western-educated prime minister. And more importantly, he was democratically elected by the Iranian people. Mossadegh wanted Iran to control its own oil. At the time, British interests, specifically the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later became British Petroleum, were taking the lion's share of Iranian oil profits. Mossadegh said no more. He nationalized the oil industry. And that's when the trouble began. Britain wasn't having it. They tried to push back economically and diplomatically. But when that didn't work, they turned to their ally, the United States. President Eisenhower had just come into office, and the Cold War was heating up. And the word nationalization sounded dangerously close to communism. That's all it took. Enter the CIA. Operation Ajax was born, a full-blown covert op to topple a democratically elected leader. The CIA, along with British intelligence, began spreading propaganda. They paid off Iranian military officers, organised mobs, and staged violent protests to create chaos in the streets of Tehran. Then, they bribed members of parliament and the press. And finally, in August 1953, Mossadegh was ousted. In his place, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was reinstalled with full US backing. He was young, pro-Western, and more importantly, he was open for business. The oil went back under Western control. Washington celebrated. The mission was a success. But that so-called success came at a cost that wouldn't fully reveal itself until decades later. The Shah ruled with an iron fist. His secret police, SAVAK, trained by the CIA and Mossad, were brutal. Thousands of Iranians were imprisoned, tortured, or disappeared. Political dissent was crushed. The gap between the elite and the poor widened. And all the while, the US was seen as the silent partner in his repression. By the late 1970s, the people had had enough. In 1979, Iran exploded in revolution. The Shah fled. And in his place came Ayatollah Khomeini and an Islamic republic built on one core belief: anti-Americanism. And who could blame them? From their perspective, the US had destroyed their democracy, installed a dictator, and propped him up for 25 years. The hostage crisis that followed wasn't just about 52 Americans held for 444 days. It was about payback. This was America's first major move in the Middle East. It wouldn't be the last. But it set a precedent. Topple a regime, secure your interests, deal with the blowback later. And as we'll see, that pattern didn't stop in Tehran. It only evolved. Now let's jump to 1979, Afghanistan. The Soviet Union has just invaded, launching one of the most brutal occupations of the Cold War era. And the US, they saw an opportunity, not just to help a country under siege, but to bleed the Soviets dry, just like Vietnam had drained America. This is where Operation Cyclone comes in. It was one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history. From 1979 to 1989, the US funneled nearly $20 billion into Afghanistan. But that money didn't go to any central government or standing army. It went straight into the hands of the Mujahideen, Islamist guerrilla fighters, many of whom had their own radical agendas. The idea was simple: arm the locals, train them, and let them harass the Soviet army until they finally give up. And it worked, at least in the short term. The CIA supplied everything from AK-47s and RPGs to Stinger missiles that could take down Soviet helicopters. Saudi Arabia matched US funds dollar for dollar, and Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, acted as the middleman, deciding which fighters got the weapons and the cash. But here's where things get messy. The US wasn't too picky about who they were funding, as long as they hated the Soviets. Among the fighters receiving support were hardliners with visions far beyond Afghanistan. One of them was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. He wasn't trained by the CIA directly, but his organization, what would become al-Qaeda, flourished in the chaos that Operation Cyclone helped fuel. When the Soviets finally withdrew in 1989, the US declared victory and walked away. No rebuilding. No strategy for what came next. Afghanistan descended into civil war, and from the ashes rose the Taliban, a group of ultra-conservative fighters mostly educated in hardline madrasas along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. By 1996, they had seized control of Kabul. And who did the Taliban give sanctuary to? Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The same networks, training routes, and ideologies that had been cultivated during the anti-Soviet jihad now turned their attention westward. By the late 1990s, bin Laden had declared war on America. The US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed. The USS Cole was attacked. And then came September 11th. It's not that the US intended to create a global jihadist movement, but the short-term focus on defeating the Soviets left the long-term consequences unchecked. The tools, funding, and infrastructure America helped build during Operation Cyclone didn't just disappear. They evolved. The gamble worked in bleeding the Soviets. But it came at a cost America would pay decades later, not in Cold War chess moves, but in real lives lost from New York to Kabul. And this wouldn't be the last time Washington armed a group it would later fight. By the early 1980s, Saddam Hussein was no stranger to power games. He just launched a full-scale invasion of Iran, hoping to take advantage of the chaos following the 1979 Islamic Revolution. What he didn't expect was an 8-year bloodbath. The Iran-Iraq War became one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century, with estimates of over 1 million casualties. So where did the US stand? Right behind Saddam. At the time, Washington saw Iran's new regime, especially after the hostage crisis, as the bigger threat. So, in classic Cold War logic, the enemy of my enemy became my friend. Between 1982 and 1988, the US provided Iraq with everything short of boots on the ground. We're talking billions in agricultural credits, satellite imagery for targeting Iranian positions, and dual-use technology, equipment that could be used for civilian or military purposes. That included materials for chemical weapons. In fact, during the war, Saddam's forces used mustard gas and nerve agents, not only against Iran, but also against his own Kurdish population in Halabja in 1988, where up to 5,000 civilians were gassed to death. And yet, the US response was muted. There was no real pushback because Saddam was still our guy in the region. But that relationship didn't last. In 1990, Saddam made his biggest miscalculation. He invaded Kuwait. Overnight, the US flipped from silent supporter to fierce adversary. Operation Desert Storm followed in 1991. The US-led coalition crushed the Iraqi military in just 100 hours of ground combat. But instead of removing Saddam, the Bush administration decided to leave him in power, hoping he'd be weakened and contained by sanctions. What followed was a decade of suffering. UN sanctions devastated Iraq's economy, leading to widespread malnutrition and the collapse of healthcare infrastructure. UNICEF reported that by the late 1990s, over 500,000 Iraqi children may have died due to the sanctions. Saddam, meanwhile, tightened his grip and weaponized the suffering for propaganda. Then came 2003. Armed with false intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, the US invaded Iraq under President George W. Bush. Saddam's regime collapsed quickly, but there was no real post-war plan. The US disbanded the Iraqi army, purged Ba'ath Party officials from government, and left a massive power vacuum in a deeply divided country. That vacuum didn't stay empty for long. Disbanded Sunni officers, humiliated and jobless, teamed up with jihadist networks. By 2004, al-Qaeda in Iraq had formed, and by 2014, that group evolved into something even more lethal, ISIS. So, let's step back. The US backed Saddam when it was convenient, then turned against him when it wasn't, then took him out with no plan for the aftermath. The result? A broken Iraq, endless sectarian conflict, and the rise of one of the most brutal terrorist groups in modern history. Saddam may be long gone, but the chaos unleashed in Iraq didn't die with him. It just changed flags. When US troops rolled into Baghdad in 2003, it was supposed to be a swift operation, remove Saddam Hussein, eliminate his weapons of mass destruction, and install a friendly, democratic government. But the weapons didn't exist, and the aftermath wasn't peace. It was chaos. The invasion may have been a tactical success, but the occupation, that's where everything unraveled. The US made two critical decisions that changed Iraq forever. First, the Coalition Provisional Authority disbanded the Iraqi military. An estimated 400,000 trained soldiers, most of them Sunni, were sent home jobless and angry. Second, de-Ba'athification purged thousands of government workers with even the slightest ties to Saddam's regime. That meant no teachers, no administrators, no security forces. Iraq's state collapsed almost overnight, and into that vacuum stepped the insurgency. But here's where it gets even more dangerous: Camp Bucca. This US-run detention facility near the Kuwaiti border became a breeding ground for future jihadists. It held thousands of prisoners, many without formal charges. Inside, hardline Islamists and former Saddam-era officers were thrown together with little oversight. It became what some later called Jihadi University. One of its most infamous alumni, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the man who would go on to lead ISIS. At Camp Bucca, radical ideologues met military tacticians. They networked, plotted, and built the foundation for what would become one of the world's deadliest terrorist organizations. And once released, many of them put that training to work. By the time the US formally withdrew from Iraq in 2011, the country was teetering. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, backed by Washington, was cracking down on Sunnis, pushing them out of power and inflaming sectarian tensions. This created fertile ground for extremist groups to re-emerge, especially in Sunni-majority areas like Fallujah and Mosul, places hit hardest by years of occupation, insurgency, and political exclusion. ISIS didn't come out of nowhere. It was built piece by years of miscalculation. They rebranded from al-Qaeda in Iraq, took advantage of Syria's civil war, and stormed back into Iraq in 2014 with shocking speed. Within months, they captured Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, and declared a caliphate. They rolled across the region with brutal efficiency, mass executions, forced conversions, and a social media strategy that terrorized the world. But their leadership structure? It traced back to Camp Bucca. Many of ISIS's assays, Damputin Farkan's IS top commanders, had been detained there. So while the US may have decapitated Saddam's regime, the policies that followed gave life to something far more chaotic and far less predictable. The invasion didn't just topple a dictator, it cracked open a fault line that would ripple through the entire region. A war meant to stabilize the Middle East ended up giving rise to ISIS, reshaping global terrorism for the next generation.